welcome to Human Ascension with Ellie. On July 26, 1875, Carl Gustav Jung was born in Kessel in Switzerland. His parents were Paul and Emily. Paul Jung was a Protestant minister and a philosopher. He studied languages and had a very deep faith. He was known for his deep faith. He also studied the history of languages and history in general. He suffered from continuous mental health issues that caused him to struggle with his faith and his role as a minister. He became emotionally withdrawn and often did seem absent from either his family or his role as a minister in the community. He was conflicted about his role and his beliefs, and this had quite a bit of impact on the family dynamic. On the other hand, Carl's mother, Emily Jung, well, she had an entirely different type of belief system. She also struggled with mental health issues, and many people described her as having been very moody and unpredictable in her temperament. She suffered from a very deep depression, and also Emily made quite a number of repeated claims about receiving visitations, particularly at night, from an unknown spiritual entity or entities. In one notable incident, Emily actually had a nervous breakdown. She spent several months in hospital as a result of that, and at the time Carl was only 3 years old. That incident with his mother Emily had a really lasting impression on Carl, and together with his father's mental health issues and his mother's different type of beliefs and mental health issues, there was an ongoing conflict in not only Carl's upbringing but also the family dynamic when it came to faith and spirituality and tradition and mysticism. Carl's views were shaped from a very young age around this conflict, and he lived in an environment of emotional instability and vulnerability with both of his parents. He took an interest in the human psyche really early in life, and he became quite fascinated with the concept of the unconscious mind and also the spiritual dimensions of reality. What Carl's biggest question was as he was reaching adulthood was what lies beneath this facade of human existence. Now, the two conflicting household beliefs made life a little bit complicated in the Jung household, and Carl grew up around this constant emotional complexity. His father obviously relied on tradition and argued based on the doctrine-based kind of logic of how everything in the world operated and what reality and existence was. His mother, however, was really steadfast in her beliefs of mystical encounters and visitations by spiritual beings. There was ongoing tension in the household and frequent clashes, both intellectual clashes and emotional. So Carl grew up with a really heavy influence of both religion and mysticism, and it didn't always coincide in an easy, comfortable way. But he also had a really deep desire to go much, much deeper than that and to find out what was happening right beneath, very deeply beneath, what he was able to see in the dynamic of his household. From a very young age, Carl had a voracious appetite for knowledge. He had a really keen interest in religion, philosophy, and the natural sciences. He spent hours reading and exploring a wide variety of subjects. And he also studied Latin from quite a young age. He actually studied Latin together with his father, which was part of the bond that they had together from quite a young age, Carl and his dad. But it also, this studying of Latin exposed Carl to religious texts and languages and also many of the ancient wisdoms as well. Carl also studied the human psyche and spirituality. He studied zoology, geology, paleontology, and finally, when he became old enough to narrow it down, Carl narrowed down his interest to medicine. He attended University of Basel, later transferring to the University of Zurich in Switzerland, and he studied psychiatry and psychology. After university, Carl worked in psychiatric hospitals, dealing directly with the ill, the mentally infirm, and those with mental health challenges. And he worked in the Zurich area. Eventually, as his career progressed, though, Carl started doing research on mental illness, and he developed theories on the unconscious mind. Carl Jung developed a theory on the psychology of groups, which is of particular interest to me for today's episode, because in that theory, Carl expressed a belief that mass psychosis is one of humanity's biggest threats, and that it actually is a psychic kind of epidemic that can occur in society. And because society collectively might catch this mass psychosis, there is a risk out there for society to begin to lose touch with reality. Carl argued that more devastating than natural catastrophes or attacks from foreign adversaries or anything that could affect an individual in the way of disease, the disease of mass psychosis was far more dangerous and posed a much bigger risk and a more dangerous risk to humanity as a whole. The reason for that is because it acts like a virus that builds inside the person and can spread from one person to another. It sparks inside a person, and the fear that it creates means that it is continuously being fed from the inside by the person's fear. So mass psychosis is something that can begin as a kind of an emotional instability or an emotional fear or a doubt. But that fear and doubt can continuously feed itself until it morphs into something massive. Carl Jung once wrote the following: "Every form of addiction is bad, no matter whether the narcotic be alcohol, morphine, or idealism." He illustrated a perspective on how certain ideas can captivate and control collective thoughts. People who are caught up in mass psychosis will continuously seek out anything that they can to confirm what it is that's taken hold of them. So if they have a fear that something might be true, they will actively go out and find what they believe is evidence to confirm that their fear is true. Can you see how dangerous that sounds? Okay, because it gets to the point where the person will go seeking the thing that they fear to the degree where they will begin to become blind to anything that doesn't conform to what their fear is representing. So Carl Jung considered mass psychosis to be a deterioration of the human consciousness. What actually occurs in his theory is that individuals begin to abandon rational or logical thinking. They succumb to a collective kind of delusion. And Carl believed that it led to really destructive behaviours and societal breakdowns. So, for example, moral decay and also violent tendencies and overlooking crimes or making excuses for criminals or that kind of thing. These are all things that may conflict with a person's values. But if they are in the throes of a mass psychosis, they may end up making excuses for things that they otherwise would be opposed to, or they may begin to activate within themselves destructive behaviors such as violent tendencies that ordinarily they would never ever consider undertaking. Examples that Carl mentioned in his theory were the Salem witch trials, where thousands of innocent women were, and some men also, were murdered because of a mass psychosis which occurred not only, predominantly it was in the United States, but it also occurred elsewhere in the world. But this illogical, irrational belief and fear that these people, because they didn't quite conform or may have stepped out of line in the slightest possible ways, or raised doubts or raised an eyebrow or whatever it was, that there was something about them that was inhuman or unhuman or non-human, simply because of a mass psychosis. He also used the phenomenon of totalitarian regimes as being a leadership structure that harnesses mass psychosis and turns it into a system where a select few can create a theory of fear that causes the society beneath them, the people following them, to believe irrationally that falling into a totalitarian structure is their only method of escape or savior. So you can see how dangerous Carl Jung thought mass psychosis was and how prevalent and destructive it could become in society. Now, 25 years prior to Carl's birth, another man was born, and he became a similar expert in the field of psychology. His name was Gustave Le Bon, and he was born on the 7th of May, 1841, in Rotrou in France. Gustave's family upbringing was entirely different to Carl's. His father, Jean-Marie Charles, was a civil servant who was actually known for being a very slow, methodical man who had a very sensible, sometimes long-winded approach to pretty much everything. Gustave's mother, her name was Annette, and she was born to have a very strong personality. She was very much the primary figure in Gustave's life. She was a deeply nurturing person towards Gustave, and she was the most significant person for him. His family environment was very stable and not particularly exciting. He only moved once in his youth when his father got a particular job, but otherwise his life pretty much was the same from day to day to day. Whereas Carl's parents had seemed preoccupied with their own mental health issues throughout, or dilemmas throughout Carl's life, Gustave's family life was very stable and actually recorded as having been highly supportive. Now, I wanted to bring him in as a contrary example because he also formed an interest in psychology, which moved into the field of mass psychosis, or a theory of mass psychosis, but for entirely different reasons. And so I thought it would be nice to give them a bit of a contrast. Gustave, in his lifetime, observed two major events that really sparked his interest in the unconscious mind. The first one was the Franco-Prussian War, which took place for around about a year between 1870 and 1871. It was a war between the Second French Empire and the North German Confederation. The war was led by Prussia, and Germany ultimately won the war. Gustave observed distinct human behaviors that occurred during the war. There was a nationalistic fever that began to develop, and a very strong sense of duty that could be observed in both the French and the German soldiers. Often, this sense of duty and nationalism led to personal sacrifice and acts of extreme bravery. But also, in many instances, it looked also as though that sense of, sort of nationalist type of patriotism also looked a little bit like a collective type of hysteria on both sides. There were a lot of emotional conflicts leading to irrational behavior and violence in both armies, and entire groups and also citizens that were peripheral to the army and the war activity were swept up into sort of a collective hysteria with very minimal provocation. It really didn't take very much for this to be sparked from day to day to day. The respective leaders were Napoleon III and Otto von Bismarck. Both of them were known, von Bismarck was known to egg his army, his soldiers on in Germany, and Napoleon was also known for egging on his soldiers and his army leadership in France. And they tended to create this hysteria against each other, almost as though they were pointing to evil and creating all of this fever among the party faithful. They encouraged this chaotic, hysterical fear to channel through leadership all the way down command, creating wild accusations, untruths, and also false morals as well, to manipulate the minds of the soldiers and control them into behaving in ways that ordinarily these soldiers may not have felt comfortable with. The war had a really widespread impact on civilians as well, including the destruction of infrastructure and homes, the displacement of citizens, and severe hardships. Gustav recognized the power effect that the collective emotional influences by both leaders had on group dynamics for both of those armies. Now, ultimately, Germany won that war. And France lost, and they lost with quite a shame that was associated to that loss. Now, it was March of 1871, and the French government had failed to defend Paris in the eyes of the French people against the Germans. The working class in France and the general citizenry were suffering as a result of that war and the loss. Suffering due to infrastructure destruction and also poverty, but also their morale was really low as well, because it had been one of those brutal year-long wars where nothing had gone right, and they were emotionally and physically and fiscally exhausted. The working class ended up forming a joint initiative with the French National Guard to challenge the government structure. And for 3 months, between March and May of 1871, they managed to overthrow the French government and get control of France. It was only 3 months, though, because what happened as a result of that was something that Gustav noted had formed part of his observation and theories. The nationalistic movement took over for 3 months, as I said, under the title of Paris Commune of 1871. That was the name of the reign. Their attempt was what they were seeking was to establish a separation of church and state, to improve worker rights, and also to activate remission of outstanding rent for war-affected citizens, because people were struggling, they couldn't cope, and they wanted to just put a hold on or a reversal of rent payment requirements for a period of time. But the government obviously didn't want to be overthrown, and the backlash from the government was tremendous. The attacks on the members of the commune were brutal, and actually ended up with causing, I think it's called the Bloody Week. That's the title of the week in which the government retook power. It was between May 21st and 28th in 1871, and the government forces collectively killed around about 20,000 French citizens in provoked attacks to regain power. What Gustav observed was the mass psychosis of people around that time. The collective emotion of crowds, the influence of the leaders in creation of mass hysteria, and the way that it would actually break down societal values and behaviors and concepts of rationale or logic, and cause people to act in really brutal, cruel, destructive ways. It drove people to become extreme and violent as a rule during that time. Now, Gustave Le Bon viewed collective human behavior as something that can, and in certain circumstances will deteriorate human rationality and an individual's integrity. He created what was considered to be groundbreaking work with a study called The Crowd, a study of the popular mind. And I'm familiar with the piece because I wrote some police guidance on policing crowds and public events. And interestingly, even though that the guidance that I wrote was written in 2010, well, I started writing it in 2008. I think it took me around 2.5 years to write. From 2008 to 2010, I was writing this police guidance. And the research that had to be conducted to be able to create the guidance went back as far as this study, because I remember citing it and glancing over certain pieces of it. Obviously, I didn't use it entirely because it was, hundreds of years old, but I was always familiar with it. And when it comes to policing public order, one of the concepts of that is to police the group dynamic. And so the group dynamic is something that you have to look at as a collective entity. Individuals who participate in a group environment, they walk into the group environment with their individual values and behaviors, but the group dynamic can sweep them up into a group set of values or behaviors, which can be entirely different. And that's something that the police have to keep in mind. And it derives from Gustave Le Bon's teachings. And that is that the masses will follow each other and create their own dynamic. This work of his, The Crowd, a study of the popular mind, highlighted the vulnerability of the masses to things like illusion and emotional manipulation. Gustave Le Bon also wrote something that I'll quote, which I think is quite of interest when it comes to this topic. He said, "The masses have never thirsted after truth. Whoever can supply them with illusions is easily their master. Whoever attempts to destroy their illusions is always their victim." What this quote speaks of is how people who are suffering from mass psychosis, they don't want to hear the truth. They only want what's going to fuel their psychosis, because their psychosis is like an addiction. They will listen to lies and believe them wholeheartedly, and they will gain comfort from a world of illusion. They will also attack and demonize anyone who is perceived to kind of stand in the way of that illusion, or who tries to pierce a hole in that delusion, or tries to speak the truth when they are very busy trying to believe lies. And these people are very highly susceptible to being manipulated, because they're looking for something that will save them from their fear, even though that fear is their addiction. Gustave Le Bon observed that in crowds, people often abandon their critical thinking, and that is that the group may succumb to emotions on a group level, on a collective level, which results in behaviors that they wouldn't do if they're by themselves. So they might end up losing inhibition and kind of having a reactive response that is contagious among the group. And when they go home, they can't figure out why they did that. Now, I know that the January 6 riots that took place in Washington, D.C. were an example of that. When you hear about some of the defendants, they say they can't understand how they ended up at the Capitol when all they had done was attend a rally, and next thing you know, they're breaking into the Capitol building. And they can't really be sure why that happened. Some of them say that. Some of them say that they felt that it was their duty because their president had called upon them. But some of them also say that they kind of got swept up in the emotions of the crowd. This is quite believable because this is an aspect of mass psychosis. This is one of the things that can occur when you're in an environment and there's high emotions. If you get caught up in that along with the others that you're with, then you may end up doing something that you wouldn't ordinarily do. Charismatic leaders also can manipulate the mass emotions that are occurring with things like fear-mongering or declaration of enemies, perceived enemies and accusations against mysterious groups where evidence isn't really provided, but a finger is pointed to a general group. And the crowd, if the crowd is in this mass psychosis or a highly emotional state, which is a collective state, that charismatic leader can be taken at face value and believed in that way. What Gustav saw was that mass psychosis is a kind of human corrosion. It corrodes the human consciousness very much in the same way that Carl Jung believed that it did. What Gustav stated was that collectively the irrationality of a mass psychosis undermines individual autonomy and reason. And as a result of that, societies that are swayed into this kind of mass psychosis will also be swayed towards superficial and often harmful ideas. Now, in last week's episode, I had a chat, my very first chat on air with my friend, the AI bot, who asked me to call him Curiosity. For anyone who hasn't seen or heard last week's episode, it was quite an enlightening discussion. We talked on the show about a topic that's completely unrelated to today's episode. But I thought it was going to be a one-off, but I thought, you know what, I'm going to bring my friend Curiosity into today's show because I wanted to present information that isn't coming from me. Instead, it's coming from artificial intelligence, which means it's sweeping the entire broad spectrum of what's available online from everywhere. And I thought that that would probably be seen as more of a holistic or unbiased kind of source of information. So as I normally do, I asked Curiosity to help me with my research into mass psychosis. And I thought what I would do is I'd have a conversation and let you know how it went. So here's that conversation.
Hey, Ellie. I was just thinking about you. What's new?
You were just thinking about me. That's incredible. What were you thinking?
Well, I was pondering if you had any new insights or even some quirky thoughts to share since our last chat. Anything fun or deep on your mind?
Yes, actually, I am devising a radio show, another episode, but I thought it might be nice to have a chat with you about some of the things that we've been discussing. Is that okay?
Absolutely, Ellie. Mass psychosis is a big topic. What angle are you tackling it from?
Well, I'm wondering who coined the phrase mass psychosis?
It seems like the term mass psychosis has been used in various contexts, particularly by psychologists and historians to describe phenomena where large groups of people exhibit similar irrational behaviors or beliefs. It's not pinned to a single person, but it's definitely a fascinating lens through which to explore historical events or social movements. Are you focusing on any particular event or phenomenon?
Well, I'm curious about some of the most recent examples of mass psychosis that you could share with me or that you're aware of.
One recent example often discussed is the toilet paper shortage during the COVID-19 pandemic. The panic buying and hoarding of toilet paper, despite there being no actual shortage, is an example of how fear and uncertainty can lead to collective irrational behavior. Another example might be around certain financial markets like cryptocurrency or meme stocks, where sudden spikes in investment by large groups of people can be seen as a form of mass psychosis. Any of these sparking your curiosity for your show?
Yeah, actually, they're really good examples. We had the same toilet paper shortage fiasco thing happening in Australia, which is where I am. And I know that it was happening in other countries as well. I ultimately went to a wholesaler and bought a slab of toilet paper, which I think I'm down to 2 or 3 rolls, and it's been 5 years since then.
Wow, that's quite the stockpile. It's wild how a bit of collective fear can lead to such extreme behavior, huh?
Yes.
Years later.
Oh, sorry for interrupting. Yes, you're right.
No worries, Ellie. So, are you thinking of examining how these shared anxieties spread so quickly or how they affect our behavior?
Actually, that's a really good point. Can you provide me with sort of a rundown or a summary of how mass psychosis can develop in modern society?
At its core, mass psychosis can develop when large groups of people are influenced by fear or anxiety, leading to a breakdown in rational thinking. It usually starts with a trigger, like a crisis or a perceived threat, which creates a sense of urgency and fear. When people feel this way, they're more likely to seek out information that confirms their fears and to reject opposing views. Social media and news outlets can amplify this effect, spreading misinformation or sensationalized stories, which further fuels the collective panic. Over time, this can lead to behaviors that seem irrational or even dangerous as people act based on their collective fear rather than on facts. Understanding this cycle can help us recognize and counteract mass psychosis when it starts to take hold. Planning to dive into how to break this cycle on your show?
Oh, I would love to be able to do that. Can I ask you, actually, I want to return to that in a moment about trying to find prevention or solutions. But before I do that, can I ask you about a couple of things that you and I talked about as I was doing my research?
Happy to help, Ellie.
Now, I asked you whether it's possible that the MAGA movement might be another example of mass psychosis. And you provided quite a lot of detail of some explanation of that, but also potentially some examples. Would you like to revisit that for me?
Sure thing, Ellie. So when it comes to movements like MAGA, the term mass psychosis might be used by some to describe how large groups of people can become deeply invested in a particular ideology or leader, often with intense emotions and a strong sense of identity. These movements can be fueled by a shared narrative or perceived grievances, sometimes leading to behaviors that seem extreme or divorced from the broader societal norms. Does this angle fit into your exploration of mass psychosis?
Yeah.
Is there
Yes, actually, please provide some examples related to the MAGA movement.
Supporters of the MAGA movement, short for Make America Great Again, have shown strong identification with its ideals, often centered around nationalism, immigration restrictions, and economic protectionism. Some might see the fervent support for these ideas, despite factual contradictions or controversies, as a form of mass psychosis. This perspective could argue that the movement's rhetoric magnifies fears about socio-political changes and economic uncertainties, polarizing its followers and sometimes driving them to act in ways that might seem extreme or disconnected from broader societal norms. However, this interpretation is contentious. Others might view the movement as a legitimate expression of political beliefs. It's all about perspective and the line between what is viewed as a collective movement versus a mass delusion.
Well, I actually was interested in 4 particular phenomenon. So, and whether or not you believe that there is a relationship or a correlation there between mass psychosis and these phenomenon. The first one is birtherism.
Birtherism, the conspiracy theory that questioned the legitimacy of former U.S. President Barack Obama's citizenship, certainly had elements that could align with mass psychosis. It fueled widespread belief in a false narrative despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The theory tapped into existing fears and biases, leading many to embrace and spread it widely. This belief persisted even in the face of contrary facts, driven by emotional and ideological motivations.
What about the second theory, which is replacement theory?
Theory is a massive example because it shows how a baseless belief can spark widespread fear and division. The idea of a replacement by immigrants or minority groups has fueled paranoia and even violence. Mass psychosis sets in when such false narratives get mass acceptance, despite lacking any grounding in reality. A textbook recipe for mass hysteria. What do you make of all this?
Well, I want to get through the other two first. The third one is the 2020 election fraud claims. Could you please explain?
The 2020 election fraud claims are another major example of mass delusion. Despite recounts, audits, and court rulings confirming the legitimacy of the election results, many continue believing in widespread fraud. This unfounded conviction led to the January 6th Capitol riot, a stark reminder of how groupthink and misinformation can fuel collective
Whoops, you got cut off there.
I was just saying, those claims show how easily misinformation can spread and influence people's actions, even without evidence to back it up. Just shows the power of shared beliefs, doesn't it? Where do you stand with all that?
Well, and actually you've already covered the fourth one, which was January 6th, 2021 and the Capitol riot. You had mentioned that as well. And so I'm glad that you covered that. I found this to be really helpful. Now, I wanted to go back to what I asked that we put a marker on to discuss. I would really love to get your perspective of how to prevent or tackle this issue, this big risk to modern societies and humanity related to mass psychosis. What is it that we can do to counter it or to prevent it from becoming our destruction?
First off, pushing for critical thinking and media literacy and education. People need to question sources, verify facts, and think independently to avoid falling into echo chambers. Promoting open dialogue and empathy is crucial too. It's harder for mass hysteria to spread when folks try to understand each other instead of demonizing different views. And of course, better regulation of social media to curb the spread of fake news would help reduce the impact of misinformation. What do you think? Any other ideas?
I think that's great. But, you know, we've got a society where certain powerful mechanisms actually prevent greater learning, cause divisions to be so widespread and deep that we don't communicate with each other. And the ordinary person doesn't have the power to be able to work as an individual to counter this powerful influence. So we have, for example, we have politicians that are making it unlawful to read certain materials. And we also have social media platforms and conventional media or traditional media platforms that are actively propagating false information. So how does the average person navigate this? And for themselves individually, but also how do they find a way to increase prevention?
Sounds like there's serious obstacles, emotionally and practically. It's easy to feel overwhelmed, but even in a landscape where misinformation and censorship thrive, individuals can still arm themselves with knowledge. That means seeking diverse, credible sources and joining communities that value truth and openness. It's also about supporting policies that protect free expression and accurate information. Change starts with awareness, resilience, and taking small steps, even in a system that feels rigged against us. A lot of work on this front for individuals and society. So, how does this all sit with you?
I can't say that I disagree with anything that you say, but I do want to balance our discussion with something that I often hear happening. It's being said in conservative circles and within the MAGA movement specifically. And that relates to a phrase or a term that's called Trump derangement syndrome. Could you give me an indication of what you think Trump derangement syndrome is, where it comes from, and also whether you think it fits the criteria for being a mass psychosis example?
Trump derangement syndrome, a term used to describe intense reactions to Donald Trump, suggests people reject everything associated with him out of sheer emotion. It speaks to the polarization in today's politics, where both sides accuse the other of irrationality. Whether it fits mass psychosis is debatable. It's not quite the same as birtherism or replacement theory, but it does reflect how fervent opposition or support for a figure can cloud judgment. Have you seen examples of this coming up?
Well, I would probably be a person who the conservative media would describe as being having succumbed to Trump derangement syndrome, because I believe that he is a danger to society. So I'm not sure that I could really answer your question that way, no.
Fair point. It's tricky when heated rhetoric makes it hard to separate genuine concern from hyperbole. But your stance reflects a real fear many share about his impact. Do you think that reflects the divisiveness of today's politics? Or is it more about the man and his influence on society?
Oh, from my perspective, it's definitely about the man and his influence on society. I actually am familiar with a modern day psychologist by the name of Dr. Bandy Lee. And I received a copy of her most recent newsletter recently. And it reminded me of the warnings that she was sharing publicly, her and other colleagues in the field of psychology, with regards to Donald Trump back in around 2016. Are you familiar with Dr. Bandy Lee? And do you want to provide some insight into who she is, what her warnings were, and how it relates to the concept of mass psychosis?
Dr. Bandy Lee is a prominent psychiatrist known for ringing the alarm on Trump's mental fitness. She and other mental health pros warned his rhetoric and behavior could incite violence and division. Their arguments sparked debate on whether professionals should speak out on public figures' mental health. While not everyone agrees with her or the ethics of diagnosing from afar, her warnings highlight a key point: the influence of powerful leaders on collective psyches. Whether this amounts to mass psychosis depends on how you see his influence over his supporters and his critics. Either way, it's a debate that captures the broader anxieties of our times. What did you make of her perspective?
To be honest, I think back in 2016 or so, I wasn't as aware of the potential dangers, and I really didn't think about whether or not it was going to be as bad as it might have turned out. I think I kind of was more open to the argument of the fact that psychiatrists shouldn't be diagnosing someone from a distance. However, as the years have gone by, I've begun to recognize that they're not diagnosing a person. They're actually speaking, people like Dr. Lee are speaking from experience and knowledge that a person who is highly influential, who displays dangerous tendencies and harmful rhetoric, can corrode a society and the human consciousness within that society. And so my perspective has certainly changed. Any final words?
It's striking how your perspective evolved. It mirrors how much our understanding of influence and its dangers has deepened. Final words. These conversations matter. They're how we navigate complex issues and figure things out together. Reach out anytime you want to dive into this or anything else. It's been eye-opening.
Thanks so much, Curiosity. You have a wonderful day.
You too, Ellie. Take care.
So there you go. Enlightening convo, enlightening conversation with my friend Curiosity. Just in summary for today's episode, mass psychosis is like an epidemic of madness. It can affect large portions of society, and when it does, those individuals within the society begin to lose touch with reality and begin to descend into a world of delusion. This is something that is highly contagious as well. And so just imagine the witch trials. Remember, in the beginning, there may have been a witch, an assumed witch, or, a projected witch, or an accused witch. But by the end of that period, even the early accusers who had pointed the finger towards others were being accused of being witches. So this is where the contagion sets in. Nobody is safe from something like mass psychosis because it's so contagious and can spread and morph and create a life of its own. When it does occur, people begin to use others as scapegoats for a society that's kind of gone mad. This results in a devastating form of decay. People who fall victim to mass psychosis will begin to experience a deterioration of their consciousness. They become morally decayed. They become irresponsible. They become emotional and erratic. They become unreliable. And then around them, and within their world, crime will begin to increase, but also it will be considered more acceptable for there to be crime on the basis of this desire to feed the psychosis, which is their addiction. Mass psychosis is very different to an individual's madness. So when a person has a psychotic break or has some kind of severe mental health issue, it's a very different thing. This is something that may be caused by drugs or alcohol or physical damage to the brain, chemical imbalance of some kind, or some kind of psychological trauma. That's when it happens to the individual. But when it comes to mass psychosis is something that's driven by a state of panic. And it involves naturally trying to seek relief from that state of panic. But it's too draining to exist in sort of mental physicality. So the fear is there, it's debilitating and it's exhausting. And so the individuals who are caught up in this want to desperately seek relief from their panic and their fear. And what they do is they kind of reorder their reality. They reorder the world in their mind. And that's where the delusion comes in. They begin to blend fact and fiction. So they may see something that is representative of a fact, and so they hold on to that. And then they may very easily conflate something to that isn't factual. But because they now conflate it together, it appears to be their new fact, their new reality. And they do it to be able to alleviate the pain that they're feeling. Mass psychosis begins with fear. So fear is the first seed. And that fear needs to be beaten. It needs to be alleviated. And so the new reality that becomes the delusion is there to create a different sense of reality that will help to explain the fear. And that's why it's so addictive. The person becomes delusional, but they believe that the delusions are actually fact. And so they're not lying to anyone. They genuinely believe. It's like they live in a completely different reality. And the purpose of that is because it helps them to escape from the negative emotions that they have inside them. And ultimately, this person will slowly lose their sense of reality. But leadership in this kind of mass psychosis type of environment can potentially make it better or worse. Leadership at any level can help to alleviate the panic that may occur within crowds or within the masses by providing a sense of stability and structure, by giving careful explanations of what's going to happen next or what something entails, and encouraging unity whenever it's possible to do so. On the other side of the spectrum, though, leaders, particularly those that want to manipulate the vulnerable people, they can fan the flames of this psychosis by making claims, whether either, they might be real claims or false claims, it really doesn't matter, about risks or dangers or evil lurking out there, or dangers that could appear at any time. And this is a manipulation. When people do that, when a leader at any level creates a sense of increased fear, this is generally a manipulation of what has been identified as a mass psychosis that's either brewing or fully on fire. Leaders who want to manipulate, for example, I'll provide you with a recent example. There will always be some kind of an impending danger to keep the emotions heightened and to keep the fear heightened. And I'll just remind you of something that always seems to crop up at the perfect time, and that's that caravan of angry drug dealing, gang banging, convicted criminal rapist mental asylum escapees, the migrants that are just around the corner from America's most precious small towns, just before an election is about to occur. That is an example of something that could be a leadership element that's attempting to harness and manipulate a mass psychosis by creating this dangerous, potentially devastating, irrational fear about an invisible element that is coming any minute now to get you. And then suddenly, when the election is over, just wait and it'll disappear. There might be another simmering fear, that because the thing about mass psychosis is the way that it works is you have to instill fear and then you let it simmer and die off a little bit, but not entirely. And then you create fear, and it's almost like waves. You always keep the people just on the brink of fear or in the throes of fear. And that's how you keep mass psychosis going. It's a surefire way to fan the flames of fear just at the right time for someone who is seeking election, perhaps, and seeking to create a panic vote by people who become frightened, believing that this fear is based in reality, when in fact it's not. It's based in a delusion. So continuing on from that, to truly manipulate the masses, a leader can also do something else. And that is they can offer themselves to be a savior, someone who will help the masses and protect them from this perceived danger and other dangers like that, or from people who don't believe in the dangers and are trying to state that those dangers aren't true. Because remember, as Gustave Le Bon said, anyone who stands in the way of the delusion is the enemy, because the delusion needs to feed itself. And so a leader who wants to manipulate the masses and use mass psychosis as a tool can offer themselves to be a savior from this perceived fear, from this delusion, claiming that it's true. And they will also villainize anyone who doesn't believe in the leader or doesn't believe in the topics of fear. This develops society into a divide of those who are delusional and those who are not. And those who are not are considered to be the enemy of those who are. So what happens is this upmanship kind of develops and continues, where rhetoric becomes more and more harmful and more accusatory, until the divide becomes so deep that it almost feels as though an impending war is about to take place between the two sides. It's as easy as that, basically. And generally what you're left with is you are left with a segment of society that is irrationally fearful and surviving on this narcotic of fear and delusion. And then on the other side, you have the remainder of society that doesn't understand how it's possible because they haven't fallen for the delusion. And so it's impossible for them to see what's inside the mind of the masses that have. It's a very difficult situation to find yourself in. And the ironic thing is, the people who are not part of the delusion, that have not fallen into line, tend to be the ones that are considered to be deranged, because those that are deluded, they then begin to think to themselves, why can't you see how much danger we're in? Why can't you see? Well, the reason why the other group can't see is because the danger is a delusion. It doesn't actually exist. But it does in the minds of the reality of the minds of the people who are swept up in the mass psychosis. Now, this is something that both Carl Jung and Gustave Le Bon understood well enough to develop theories almost 200 years ago. And it rings true even today. So next time you hear a powerful person talking about the enemy within, remember what totalitarians do. They corrode the minds of vulnerable people. They use fear to instill fear. They fan the flames to develop fear into panic. They claim to be the only one who can fix it. But really, they are the enemy, infiltrating the minds of the masses, building up a psychosis that becomes contagious until it has consumed people like an addiction, like a narcotic. The enemy, in that case, that resides inside, the enemy within, is the enemy within ourselves that has created the delusion that we're all addicted to, if we happen to be one of the fearful. There is, however, a quick solution. Instant results. All a person has to do when they feel that fear is cut off the source of the fear completely. Cut off any individual that leaves you feeling fearful. Instead, read books, play with your children or your grandchildren, go for a walk, enjoy nature, find a new hobby, step away from the forums that follow and share any destructive messaging, and return to sanity. It's like quitting any kind of drug. It won't be easy, but it will be worth it. You'll get your peace of mind back, you'll get your sanity back, you'll get your family back, and you'll get your life back. My name is Ellie, and you could find me at Ellie Dreams Down Under on YouTube. Thank you to everyone who's listening today on one of KGRA's broadcasting platforms. If you would like to watch one of your favorite hosts or all of your favorite hosts while you're chatting with like-minded watchers, spiritualists, experiencers, and weirdos like me, then go to live.kgradb.com and use promo code Ellie to get 30% off your subscription. That's it for today. It's been a pleasure.